It lands right around 5,000 words. Here it is. A small body slammed down against the frozen boards of a porch. Bare feet skidded on the ice. Two thin arms wrapped around a shaking chest. The wind drove snow sideways down the street. She pressed her back to the wall and did not cry out. Her whole body shook. A pair of boots came to a stop in front of her. Big boots, cracked leather caked with mud and cold. The man crouched down. His shadow fell over her. She looked up, lips gone blue, and whispered 4 words. "I haven't eaten. 3 days." Nothing else came out. His name was Sila's Coffee, and he had almost nothing to give. A thin bedroll, a few coins, a horse he could barely feed, but he did not stand up and ride away. What that worn-out old cowboy did next stopped an entire street cold. Stay with me on this one. Now let me back it up a little, because you need to know who this man was before that morning. Sila's Coffee had ridden into Red Fork, Montana the night before, half frozen in the saddle. It was the winter of 1889, and it was a killing winter. The kind that took cattle and took men and took children who had nowhere warm to sleep. He had come down out of the high country because the last ranch he worked let its hands go when the snow came early and killed the grass under it. No work, no wages, just a road and a horse and a dog. He had spent that last night on the trail in the lee of a rock with the dog curled against his belly for warmth, and he had thought, more than once, that this might be the winter that finished him. He had made peace with that a long time ago. A man who rides alone learns too. The horse was a bony old bay named Dutch, and Silas loved that horse more than he loved most people. The dog was a cattle dog going gray around the muzzle, and his name was Biscuit, and he trotted along at the horse's heels like he had done it his whole life because he had. That was the whole world Silas owned. A horse, a dog, a bedroll, and about $4 in mixed coin knotted up in a rag inside his coat. He had counted that money twice on the trail, the way a poor man does, hoping the number might change. It never did, $4 against a whole winter. He was maybe 60 years old, though he looked older the way men look older when they have spent 40 winters outside. His hands were cracked. His beard was white in patches. People took one look at Sila's Coffee and decided he was nobody, a drifter, a saddle tramp. The kind of man a town watches out of the corner of its eye and hopes will keep moving. And here is the thing, that was mostly true. Silas had spent 30 years keeping moving. He did not stay anywhere. He did not let anybody get close. He worked, he got paid, he rode on. If you had asked the men who knew him what Sila's Coffee cared about, they would have scratched their heads. His horse, maybe. His dog. Nothing else anybody could see. A man cannot lose what he does not hold. He had learned that lesson hard, and he had built a whole life around never learning it again. So when he came down the main street of Red Fork that morning, stiff and hungry, and looking to buy a sack of oats he could barely afford, he was not looking for trouble. He had his head down against the wind, and he was doing the math. Oats for Dutch. Maybe a little hardtack for himself. That was all the money would stretch to. Red Fork was a rough little freight town, more mud than street, and nobody there owed him a thing and he owed nobody, and that suited him fine. Then Biscuit stopped. The old dog planted his feet in the snow and would not go another step. He turned his head toward the front of the mercantile and he made a low sound in his throat. Not a growl, something softer, a whine. Silas had known that dog 12 years and never once heard him make that sound over nothing. Silas looked where the dog was looking, and that was when he saw her. She was tucked into the corner where the porch met the wall, out of the worst of the wind, but only just. A little girl. 7 years old, maybe 8, it was hard to say because she was so thin. She had a dress on that was more holes than cloth, and a man's coat 3 sizes too big, and no shoes. No shoes in that cold. Her feet had gone a color that feet should never be. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were huge in a face that had no fat left on it at all. People walked past her. That is the part I need you to sit with for a second. This was market morning and the street had people on it, and they walked right past that child like she was a sack of feed somebody left out. A woman in a good coat stepped around her, gathering her skirt so it would not brush the girl. A man leading a mule looked and looked away. Nobody stopped, because everybody had their own hard winter, and a starving child on a porch was a thing you did not look at too long, or it would follow you home in your head. And they walked on anyway. Sila's coffee stopped. He did not mean to. His body just stopped the way biscuits had. He walked over. His boots hit the frozen boards. And the little girl looked up at this big rough stranger, and instead of flinching away, she said the thing she had probably been saying to every pair of boots all morning. She whispered it because she did not have the strength to say it louder. I haven't eaten. 3 days. That was the stakes right there. A man with almost nothing. A child with less than nothing. And a whole town that had already made up its mind to look the other way. Silas knelt down in the snow. His knees cracked. He was close enough now to see how bad off she was. She was shivering in bursts, then going still, and if you know cold, you know that going still is the part that kills you. She did not have long, maybe an hour. He had seen men go that way in the mountains, seen them get quiet and warm feeling right at the end, and he knew there was nothing gentle about it at all. He asked her one question quiet. "Where's your people, girl?" And she looked at him with those big eyes and she said, "Gone." Just that one word. Gone. Now Sila's coffee had ridden past 100 hard things in his life. You keep your eyes forward and you keep riding, and you tell yourself the world is the world and one man cannot fix it. He had told himself that story for 30 years, and it had kept him alive, and it had kept him alone. 30 years of riding past. But he could not ride past this one, and here is what he did, the thing that made the whole street stop. He did not toss her a coin. A coin would have been easy. A coin would have let him ride on and feel like a decent man. He reached down instead and worked his own arms out of his big canvas coat, the one keeping him alive in that wind, and he wrapped it around that little girl until only her face showed. Then he pulled off his own gloves and pushed them onto her frozen hands. And then he did the thing people talked about in Red Fork for years after. He sat right down on those frozen boards, pulled her bare blue feet into his lap, unbuttoned his shirt at the collar and pressed her feet flat against his own bare chest to warm them. A grown man in the middle of the street holding a stranger's frozen feet against his own skin so they would not die. People stopped walking. The woman in the good coat stopped. The man with the mule stopped. Because you do not see that. You see men give a nickel and ride on. You do not see a broke old drifter give a child the coat off his back and the warmth out of his own body in the middle of a Montana winter. A little crowd gathered without meaning to, half of them ashamed of themselves and not yet knowing why. The girl started to cry then. Not loud. She just leaked tears because I think it was the first warm thing that had touched her in a long time, and warmth after cold hurts before it helps. Silas didn't say much. He just said, "You're all right now." Over and over low. "You're all right. I've got you." He picked her up, coat and all, and she weighed nothing. She weighed like a bundle of kindling, and he carried her up the steps and through the door of the mercantile where there was a stove going. The storekeeper was a narrow man named Alton Wick, and he looked up from his ledger with a face that said he did not want trouble, and he did not want charity cases dripping on his floor. Silas set the girl down on a crate right next to that hot iron stove, and he pulled the rag of coins out of his coat and he laid every cent of it on the counter. $4 and some. Everything he had in the world, the oats money, the hardtack money, the staying alive money. Bread, he said, whatever's hot, milk if you got it, and a pair of shoes for her feet, smallest you carry. Wick looked at the coins, then at the girl. Then at the big coatless man with the white beard and the eyes that were daring him to say no. "Feed her," Silas said. please, and Wick, to his credit, softened. He cut a heel of bread and warmed some milk on the stove and set it in front of that child, and she ate like something wild, both hands, too fast, and Silas had to slow her down so she would not make herself sick. He tore the bread into small pieces and fed them to her one at a time, the way you gentle a starving animal into trusting the hand. Biscuit lay down across her bare feet and warmed them with his own body, and the little girl put one hand in the dog's fur and did not let go. Now here is where you would think the story ends. The child is fed, she is warm, she is inside, and for about 10 minutes everybody in that store let out a breath and it felt finished. Silas pulled a stool over by the stove and lowered himself onto it, his own hands blue now, and Wick, softened all the way through, poured the old man a cup of coffee for free. Silas wrapped both hands around it and closed his eyes for a second. Outside, the wind had even eased off and pale sun came through the frost on the window. A quiet, ordinary moment. The kind you exhale into. The kind where you think, well, that's that then. He asked the girl her name and she said it around a mouthful of bread. Ada, he nodded and said, Ada. That's a good name. That was the moment the door of the mercantile banged open so hard the glass rattled in the frame. A man filled the doorway. Big, well-fed, in a heavy buffalo coat, his face gone red from the cold and redder from something else. He had a paper in one gloved fist, and his eyes went straight past Silas and past Wick and landed on the little girl by the stove, and his mouth twisted up into something that was not a smile. There you are, he said. You little thief. Ada dropped the bread. All the blood went out of her face. She pressed herself back into the wall behind the crate, and the sound she made was not a child's cry. It was pure animal fear. She was more afraid of this man than she had been of the cold that was killing her. Take a second and understand what that means. She would rather have frozen on that porch than have this man walk through that door. A child chose the killing cold over him, 3 days running. And just like that, everything changed. Because this was not about a hungry child and a cold morning anymore. This had a claim on it now. A paper. A man who said the girl belonged to him. His name was Harmon Pratt, and he owned the biggest freight operation in that whole stretch of the territory, and he had that county in his pocket the way a rich man does. He held the notes on half the businesses on that street, and every man in the store knew it, and you could feel them all get smaller when he came through the door. He crossed the store and grabbed Ada by the arm, and she cried out, and Sila's coffee was up off that stool between them before anybody saw him move. Pratt looked at him. This coatless old tramp, and he laughed. That's bound property, old man, he said, and he shook the paper. County bond. Her folks died owing me. Died in one of my cabins on my flour, and somebody's got to work off what they owed. That's the law, signed by the magistrate. She ran off owing me $200 of labor, and I've been 3 days looking for her. $200 for a starving child, and it was legal. That was the awful part. It was all stamped and signed and legal. A poor family died in debt, and the debt did not die with them. It landed on whoever was left, even if whoever was left was a child of 7, and a man with money and a friendly magistrate could turn a dead man's grocery bill into years of a living child's labor and call it justice, and have the paper to prove it. If you are still with me here, and I hope you are, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one, about the people history walked right past, are the whole reason this channel exists, and it helps more than you know. All right, back to that store and that man and the paper in his fist. Silas looked at the paper. He could not read much, but he could read enough. Then he looked at Ada, pressed into the corner, and he saw the marks that had come up on her arm where Pratt had grabbed her, and he saw the old marks too, the faded yellow ones already there up and down that little arm, some old enough to have healed and some not. And something moved in the old man's face that Alton Wick said later he never wanted to see again. Silas said, very quiet, you starved her. Pratt said, I fed her what she earned. You worked her feet raw and turned her out with no shoes. She ran, Pratt said. That's on her. The store had gone dead silent. A couple of townsfolk had drifted in out of the cold and stood by the door, watching, saying nothing, the same way they had watched her freeze on the porch. Because Harmon Pratt was a man you did not cross in that town if you wanted to keep buying and selling in it. Every one of them had a reason to keep quiet, and every reason had a dollar sign on it. Sela's coffee took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice was not angry. That was the frightening part. It was flat and level and certain, like a man reading off a fact. I'll buy the bond, he said. Pratt laughed again. You. He looked the old man up and down, the bare arms, the patched shirt, the empty rag on the counter. You haven't got $200. You haven't got $2. You just spent your last penny on bread for my property. And that was true. That was the trap of it. Sela's had already given everything he had to keep the child alive, and now the price of keeping her free was a fortune he would never see in his life. This is what I mean when I say the story turned. An hour before, all it took to save Ada was a coat and a heel of bread. Now it would take $200 and a man's whole future, and the nerve to stand up to the most powerful man in the county with a store full of witnesses who would not lift a finger. The kindness had been the easy part. The cost was only just now coming due. Sela's walked to the window. Out in the street, tied to the rail, stood the old bay horse. Dutch, the only thing of real value the man had left in the world. Without a horse, a cowboy is just an old man on foot in the snow, and everybody in that store knew it. A cowboy without a horse in a Montana winter is a dead man who has not quite lain down yet. He turned back around. That horse, he said, is worth more than $200, and every man in this room knows it. Sound bay, good teeth, broke to anything. He looked at Wick. What'll you give me for him, honest? Wick swallowed. He was not a brave man, but he was not a liar either. He said, Sela's, that horse'll bring 250 in the spring, easy. I could give you 200 cash today. Pratt's face changed. He had expected the old man to fold. Instead, the old man was offering to sell the last thing he owned, the thing that kept him alive, to buy a child he had known for 1 hour. Do it, Sela said. Buy the horse. Pay off the bond. He looked at Pratt. Full price, 200, and you sign her free right here, right now, in front of every man in this room, and you never come near her again as long as you live. You are wondering why Pratt didn't just take the money and be glad of it. Because men like Harmon Pratt do not want money. They want a win. He had money. What he did not have and could not stand to lose was the fear he was owed. He could feel this old tramp beating him in front of a room full of people who would tell the story in every saloon between here and the railhead, and that he could not stand. So he did the thing men like him always do when they are losing. He reached for something worse. He turned toward Ada and he said, "She's mine till the paper's signed, and I'll take her back tonight either way," and stepped toward the child with his hand raised. He never finished the step. I told you at the start there was more to Sela's coffee than a broke old drifter, and here is where the town found out too. That stooped, gray, gentle man crossed the floor faster than anybody expected, and he caught Harmon Pratt's raised wrist in one cracked hand and held it. Just held it. And Pratt, who was younger and heavier and stronger, could not move that arm an inch. He strained against it, and his face went from red to something mottled, and still that old hand did not give. Whatever Sela's coffee had been, in the 30 years before he started keeping moving, it was still in those hands. He looked Pratt dead in the eye from 6 inches away, and he said low, so only Pratt could hear it, "You will not touch her again. Not now. Not ever. You are going to take the money, and you are going to sign the paper, and you are going to walk out of this town, and you are going to thank God every day that you got to walk. Do you understand me?" And Harmon Pratt, looking into that old man's face, understood him. He went pale. Because he was a bully, and bullies know in their bones. the exact moment they have finally pushed a man who is not afraid of them and has nothing left to lose. It is the one thing in the world they are truly afraid of. He had spent his whole life reading which men would fold and which would not, and it told him now, plain as a bell, that this old man would break his arm and go on talking in that same flat voice while he did it. Silas let go of his wrist. Alton Wick counted out $200 onto the counter with shaking hands, the coins loud in that silent room. And Harmon Pratt, in front of the whole store with the constable now standing in the doorway watching, took the money and he put the bond paper flat on the counter, and he signed it over free and clear. His hand shook when he did it. Ada was nobody's property anymore. She was just a little girl again. Then Pratt buttoned his big coat and walked out into the snow, and as far as anybody in Red Fork ever knew, he kept walking, and he did not come back. The constable, a decent enough man who had been too slow and too careful his whole career, cleared his throat and said the signing was legal and witnessed, and that was the end of it, as if he had done something. Nobody looked at him. They were all looking at the old man and the child. Silas walked out onto the porch. Alton Wick led the old bay horse around, and Silas Coffey stood there with his bare hand on that horse's neck for a long minute, forehead pressed to the animal's jaw, saying something nobody could hear. 30 years, that horse. Every mile of it. Then he handed over the lead rope and he did not look back at it, because a man can only do a thing like that if he does not look back. He went inside and knelt down by the crate where Ada sat with her hand still buried in Biscuit's fur. Her feet had new shoes on them now, and color had come back into them. She looked up at him, scared still, not sure what she was allowed to hope for. "Am I going with you?" she asked. And Silas Coffey, the man who had not let a single living soul get close in 30 years, the man who kept moving so nothing could ever hurt him again, said, "If you'll have a broke old fool with no horse and half a dog, then yes. You're going with me. You're not going with anybody else ever again." She put her arms around his neck and he picked her up, and this time she did not weigh like kindling. She just weighed like a child who was finally safe. Now I want to tell you the rest, because the rest is the part that mattered most. Silas Coffey did not ride out of Red Fork the next morning. He couldn't. He had no horse to ride, and he had a child now, and you do not drag a half-starved little girl out into a killing winter on foot. So he did the thing he had not done in 30 years. He stayed. He took a job mucking stalls and hauling feed at the same freight yard Harmon Pratt used to own, because the men there had watched the whole thing, and they made room for him. It was low work and cold work, and it did not pay much, but it came with a loft over the stable where a man and a child and a gray dog could sleep warm. And every night that first winter, Ada slept curled against old Biscuit, and Silas sat up by the little stove and listened to her breathe, like he could not quite believe the sound of it. People in Red Fork got used to the sight of them. The old cowboy and the little girl, walking to the mercantile, her hand in his big cracked one. She got some weight on her. She got a laugh back, and it turned out to be a loud one, a whooping laugh that turned heads. Alton Wick taught her sums behind the counter. The schoolteacher took her in for free. By spring she had shoes that fit and a dress with no holes and cheeks that were round again, and you would not have known she was the same blue-lipped child who had whispered 4 words on a frozen porch. And Silas, well, the town found out that the drifter they had almost let ride through was one of the finest hands with a horse or a rope any of them had ever seen. And inside 2 years he was running the whole freight operation, and he bought a bay horse, not the same one. That one was long gone, but a good one, and he taught Ada to ride it. One evening years later, when Ada was near grown, she asked him the question she had wanted to ask since that first day. She asked him why. Why he stopped when the whole street walked past. Why he gave his coat and his horse and his whole life to a child he had never met. And Silas Coffey was quiet a long while. Then he told her the one thing he had never told anybody. That a long time before, in another country of his life, he had a wife and he had a daughter, and a hard winter and a fever had taken them both while he was away up in the hills working, trying to earn enough to get them somewhere better. And he had come down off that mountain to an empty house, and he had never forgiven himself for not being there, and that was the real reason he kept moving all those years. Because if he never stayed anywhere, he could never lose anything again. Then he looked at her and he said, and then I came around the corner of that store and there you were, sitting in the cold, and you looked up at me, and you had her eyes, and I thought, I walked past everything for 30 years. I am not walking past this. That is what he gave that little girl. Not the coat, though the coat kept her from freezing. Not the $200, though it bought her back her own life. What he really gave her was the thing he had been too afraid to give anybody since the day he lost his own. He gave her the chance to be somebody's. And in doing it, that hardened, lonesome old man got back the one thing he thought the world had taken from him for good. He got to be a father again. He is buried in Red Fork now up on the hill, and the stone was paid for by a whole town that once walked right past him. Ada chose the words on it herself. They do not say drifter. They do not say cowboy. They say he stopped. And that is the whole of it. A killing winter, a starving child, and a broke old man who had every reason in the world to keep riding, and did not. Remember that the next time you are tempted to look away from the cold thing on the porch. Sometimes the person nobody expects anything from is the only one who stops. And sometimes, when they stop, they save 2 lives instead of 1. Note on the count. The sandbox blocked both the file write and the Heredoc word count. The command was too long for the parser, so I couldn't get a machine count this time. By paragraph level estimate, this sits at roughly 5,000 words inside your 4/800/5/200 window. If you grant write access, I'll drop it to a file and run WCW to confirm exactly and trim to 5,000 if it's off. The cuts were all in the setup, inciting and escalation beats, redundant asides and doubled framing lines. The hook is verbatim, and the resolution from now I want to tell you the rest to the end is untouched.